welcome, Eucharist, and diversity. Those are the four. And there's some element of that stuff that started from the funeral home, which is where our congregation got its start, surprisingly enough.
Could you repeat that list?
Harmony, diversity, welcome, and Eucharist. The church that we're currently in was built in 1980, and the congregation moved from Central Expressway over onto Greenville Avenue. And when they designed the church, it's built in the square, the nave. So the altar is in the middle of the room. And the altar is a big blocks of Texas limestone. It's got all the fossils and stuff in it. And they had to put it in with a crane before they built the church around it. So the church is actually built around the altar. And it really feels that way. And when you worship in a square space where you're facing people across the altar, it's a very different experience. And so frankly, if people are not comfortable with diversity, they know that they're not comfortable in Ascension very quickly, right? Because they're looking across the room at other people's faces, and those people don't look like them. And so it becomes clear very quickly if they're not, this is not going to be a place where they're going to feel comfortable. Any other questions about initial stuff? Well, let's stop for a minute and talk about what we mean by culture, multicultural, cross-cultural. These are not Webster's definitions. They're not really Eric Law's definitions. These are just sort of what I mean when I say them. So you can dispute them. I'd be happy to argue over these, but this is just what I mean, okay? By culture, I mean a collection of characteristics, habits, values, beliefs both visible and hidden, that set a people group apart from other people groups. Okay? Is that fair enough? By multicultural, I mean a gathering or a body or a work. I mean like a book or a collection of essays or a musical compilation or something, in which the influences and expressions of multiple cultures can be readily discerned. Right? So if you thought about a continuum as think about America, okay, and you think about a continuum, there are times when you would have been able to see a lot of influences of Irish culture or English culture much more strongly, or right, Russian, Mexican culture, supposed to sort of broad Hispanic. Over time, right, you can discern less and less the differences, like by over hundreds and hundreds of years. They don't disappear entirely. But so when we're talking about multicultural, we're not just talking about the fact that if we sat here, we could say, well, I sort of am Scottish, so I'm going to claim Scottish culture. Well, I don't know what Scottish culture is, right? But I am Scottish. I don't just mean that there's a bunch of people who have ancestry from different places, but a gathering or a setting in which there's clearly discernible elements of those different cultures. And so by cross-cultural, I mean the kind of work or habits that bridge between cultures. Right, so I'm from one culture and you're from another culture, and as we work together, we're doing cross-cultural work. We're not doing multicultural work. That's multicultural means it describes something else for me than the kind of work we do. So I talk about cross-cultural competency. Okay? Are those fair? Anybody want to add or change them? If you have any feedback and like to suggest to me alterations, I take suggestions. So I want to stop and talk about, therefore, some different kinds of multicultural congregations. And this is mostly adapted from Charles Foster, Embracing Diversity. It's a great book. It's a book that came out right before I went to Ascension, and I wish somebody had handed it to me. It would have saved a lot of grief that I've inflicted on other people. You know, it's a well-intentioned damage, but damage nonetheless. Okay, so some multicultural congregations are transitional. That is that they're in a changing neighborhood, and they're the first culture that's there welcomes other people, a new culture. They may seek them out, like congregations that start Hispanic ministries because they suddenly realize there's a bunch of people who are Hispanic living right around them. And they and often those people moving in are replacing some of those from the primary or host culture. Often these congregations envision a handoff of leadership and responsibility. That is, our ministry is going to continue in this place for the Episcopal Church, but we imagine in 10 years there won't be any of us left. It will be their ministry, right? So it's a transitional kind of thing. The new culture is often seen as the best hope for the future survival of the congregation. So do any of y'all, can y'all think of congregations that you know of that fit this at some level, transitional congregations? There's a lot of United Methodist congregations in Dallas that are, they've been very intentional. Some of them are Asian and some of them are Hispanic, various Hispanic. Another possibility is a sponsoring congregation. And that is where the host culture provides space or maybe other resources to people of a guest culture. And I don't mean guest culture like they're going back home sometime. It's just that they're not, they might be looking for a place to worship. We have some of these in Dallas in the Episcopal Diocese. There's a group of Korean Anglicans who have actually worshiped in several different church facilities, but they're kind of guests. They may pay, in some cases these congregations pay a little rent, or it's just a gift from the host congregation. There are various styles of collaboration and cooperation here. And it depends a little on the denomination, but also in the diocese. Often there's parallel leadership in the host and guest congregations. So that there's somebody making decisions there. They might even have a board that's negotiating rents or how much time or space or what the rules are, something like that. And then finally, the guest congregation may at some point become fully independent or move to be in some other space or work with some other congregation. There's not a lot of blending here. Okay, but sometimes we still talk about those congregations being multicultural because in their building they're having services in Spanish, Korean. Down the street from us, the Baptist Church has, and actually St. James now has a ministry in Karen, which is those from Burmese or Myanmar, where there are Episcopalians. I don't know if y'all are aware of that. Some other ones. There's the assimilative congregations, and these are congregations that welcome persons of other ethnicities, but they really expect them finally to adopt the culture of the congregation. So they don't expect to change the way the vestry works, or the way the worship looks, or the way Sunday school's offered, or things like that. They just are welcoming people, just hoping they'll become part of their main congregation. The dominant culture retains control in this in terms of leadership. So there's no sense that we need to make sure there's somebody on the vestry or something. It's just you run and you get elected and you're part of the main culture. The dominant culture in this case is assumed to be normative for the present and for the future. Okay? And then finally, and this is Foster's language, not mine. I mean, I'm not trying to sort of pat Ascension on the back, but there's the congregation he calls truly multicultural. And that is that the life of the congregation reveals influences of more than one culture. I mean, it's distinct. That the attention and resources are given to nurture, sustain, and embrace culturally specific gifts and graces of individuals and groups. And the access to power by all groups and opportunities to shape the future, requires attention and education. It doesn't just happen automatically, right? So there's intentional work done to try and bring people to the table. Things change as a result. Okay. So do y'all have some in mind? Have you experienced some of these different kinds of situations? Any questions or comments on this characterization of congregations? It's easy sometimes to think that that there's a particular gospel or godly style. And I want to encourage us not to go there too quickly. I mean, I think there's certain ones that are less helpful than others, but the reality is that when you're in a changing church, you have to negotiate and listen and discern, and any of these might be the right one given a different context. Okay, so I may characterize them in ways that sound like I find some more, what Jesus would do or something, but I really mean to say that there's places for all of these styles of congregations, and if you're going out in leadership, I do think that we're required as faithful leaders to discern how we reach out and embrace the other nations on our street corner, but which one of these is going to be the right one is not going to be clear except in a context. Okay, so wherever a congregation finds themselves, and certainly where Ascension found itself, this is always true. This statement, it's always true. Well-intentioned and faithful people can sow conflict and cause pain because culture is like an iceberg. Okay, you've heard this before if you've done Kaleidoscope. This is actually Eric Law. He adapted it from Gary Weaver, there's so many people who claim it that I'm not sure exactly where it started, but it works. Okay, why is culture like an iceberg? I say 80% is below the surface. The next slide you'll see it says 90%. I don't know how much of it is, but right, so what are the surface things of culture? What do we see, hear, taste, touch, feel? Food, right? What's the great multicultural event? Every elementary school has one across America. You got the multicultural dinner, right? Multicultural night. Everybody brings their favorite food from their culture. What else? Language, right? Language is tricky because language both has its external elements and its internal meaning. So yes, at a level, language is absolutely. What else?
Family values.
Okay, those are not external. We'll get to them in a minute.
Okay.
Dress.
Behaviors.
Okay, certain kinds of behaviors, like. Okay, again, that's like language and family values, some external, some internal. That's why it starts getting tricky, right? So the iceberg's a good illustration. I'll show you in just a minute because, right, it's not really ever clear what layer you're in. I mean, you can see what's above the water, but at a different time, it might be more under, more's over. Okay, so below the surface. Everything below the surface is more implicitly learned. It's not explicit. It's largely unconscious. The further below the surface you get, it's difficult to change. It's subjective. Okay, so if you think about the implications of why culture is like an iceberg, why does an iceberg not just break apart? Because it's got this huge mass of ice below the surface, right? So it's stable. Icebergs are stable because of the 90% that's hidden. So are cultures. Cultures continue to work. People continue to have healthy, whatever functioning, coping, because of what's below the surface. It's not because they eat a certain kind of rice with a certain kind of spice, and it's not because they dress in certain colors, right? It works because of the stuff that's under the surface. But also, the unseen ice has the greatest potential to cause pain and conflict. As Eric Law says, you can imagine two icebergs moving toward each other, and before you even see it coming, they've collided. Right? So when you head into a cross-cultural encounter, it's important to remember, culture is like an iceberg. What's not seen can really hurt you. Here's an illustration that is from the Indiana Department of Education that I think is very helpful because it doesn't delineate. Please forgive the misspellings. I can't fix them because I'm not at the Indiana Department of Education. Don't tweet that. Right, so the surface culture is most easily seen. It also has a low emotional level. They're not really that invested in that stuff. But then there's the stuff that's just below the surface. And they tend to be things like personal space, rules of conduct, how you take care of your children, whether you touch each other, whether you look somebody in the eyes when you're addressed, things like that are sort of shallow. They're unspoken rules, but people care a lot about them, right? And partly they care a lot about them because they know they do them, they know they're the way they're supposed to do things in their culture, but they don't have an answer for why. And so when confronted, it's a defensive thing, right? It's like, why do you men open doors for women? Right? Those of you who still do. Somewhere back when, your dad or mom expected you to do that or somebody else, and you found that was the right way to be. And now if you have to explain it to some sort of uppity woman who's offended by it, it causes defensiveness, right? But then you get down to deep culture. This is where the worldview, if the shallow culture is more values, the deep culture is more worldview. And it's sort of the concept of eternity and salvation and past and future, and sometimes roles in the community, things like that, become very deep. Okay, so when you think about those things, we can name off a bunch of different kinds of cultural differences. But when people go and study cultures, they find that there actually are categories of difference. And this, again, is stuff that comes out in Eric Law's work, but is also even more clearly and extensively described in James Pluteman's book, Leading Across Cultures, which I think is on your book list. And I highly recommend his book to have in addition to Eric Law's books. So if you think about those other cultural things that are just kind of lists, if you categorize, there are certain ways that all cultures differ, right? There's high context or low context. Context, this refers to the amount of unspoken clues in communication, primarily, okay? So high context cultures are cultures in which you have to really pay attention to understand what the meaning is going on in any given setting, in any conversation. So in high context cultures, relationships are very important. And if you go in and it took me forever to learn that when we had a meeting, and I was meeting with, there were Nigerians or Sudanese, or if I were needed to go talk to them about some issue, that first we had to have 15 minutes of conversation about how our families were, and where God had been seen in our lives, and all these. There was all this stuff that goes on before you get to business, and that's not just. It's easy for us Americans to think of that as sort of an annoyance. I can't think of the right way to say it. Right? Because we're low context people. We like to have an agenda.
A waste of time.
We think of it as a waste of time. It's not why we're together, right? I mean, there's a set of work we got to get done. And when you have to do all that other stuff, the work we think won't get done. Low context is where everything can be sort of spelled out, written down. What I say is what I mean. So if you invite me to a party and I can't go, what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to say no, right? No, not in a high context culture. Right? In a high context culture, I'm supposed to say how much I want to go and how I'll try to go, even if I know I can't go. I mean, I don't mean this absolutely uniformly. All I mean to say is that those very things are culturally driven. What we're supposed to do in different circumstances are culturally driven. And so high context culture people and low context culture people can often get into trouble because our communication is all messed up. I miss all the signals. I've actually learned to tell my Igbo priest, I don't always get it. So if I'm clearly missing the point, you're going to have to tell me, because otherwise I'm going to do something that's going to hurt the community, because I still, after 12 years, haven't figured out how to do high context culture. Okay, so that's sort of in communication what goes on. Some cultures are collectivist, and some cultures are individualist. What's America mostly? Individualist, right? It's an easy one. Okay, what does it mean to be an individualist culture? It means that the worth of the group is worth anything only insofar as it advances the development of the individual. Right? And if you're in a collectivist culture, switch it over. And that is the worth of the individual is only insofar as it advances the cause of the group. Overly simplistic, but important, right? So in the Anglican Church in Nigeria, the priest says what needs to be done, and the people come and do it. Okay, so at Ascension, we'd have a work day, and the Nigerians wouldn't show up. It's like, why don't any Nigerians show up? And they say to me, well, tell us as a group what you need us to do, and we will make arrangements to do it. And I was thinking, but I want to know what your gifts are, and you come serve the church. And they're saying, no. You tell us as a group what we need to do. And it's just it's one of those areas where you miss, because I think I'm doing the thing that is affirming by paying attention to the individual, and that's not comfortable. That's not how they work. For them, it calls people out, right? And if the person's not able to fulfill the thing, then they're embarrassed. But if you ask the group, then the group together can figure out how to get the thing done. There's a lot more depth you could plumb in that distinction. High power distance or low power distance. I think this is one of the cultural differences that is of the most important in the Anglican Communion and the Episcopal Church. High power distance means that the people who are led are comfortable with the leader having more status, more power, and more authority, more privilege. Okay, so it's important that we don't miss this. This is not about people being dictators. This is about the culture being comfortable with the leader having more status, power, and authority. Whereas in low power distance, right, this is more, we think about being egalitarian. Everybody has a say. We build consensus. We're going to decide together. why do I say that this is the most important distinction in the Anglican Communion? Anybody have any ideas? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking of there's a big push in a lot of corners of the Anglican community that want Rowan Williams, for instance, the Archbishop, to be Pope-like, to really distance themselves and be more autocratic and tell us all how we're supposed to act and stuff. Whereas the Episcopal Church is a little more, no, we need to figure out as a group what's best for us, and because we all feel like we have power.
Right. That's good. So one of it is just the function of our leaders, especially the archbishops, sometimes even bishops, right? Or in the House of Bishops. Okay.
I think post-colonialism plays into this a lot.
Okay. Say more about that.
We don't want people who don't know our culture making rules about our, or for our churches within our culture.
Right. Yes, and that's it. And so when that we both feel that way, right? I mean, so the African and Asians who have been colonized, they feel that way. And for us who were colonized, right? But we threw it off in a different way. We have strong feelings. Good. Okay. There's one other. I mean, there's probably a ton other, but one other thing that I think is really important here is that our approach to power distance also impacts our understanding of Scripture. Okay? High power distance cultures aren't just high power distance in relation to people, but other kinds of authority. And low power distance cultures are not just egalitarian in response to people, but in response to their sacred texts. And so when we're trying to read, this comes out, Ascension, there's a real challenge here because people expect certain kinds of preaching and certain kinds of approach to the Bible. And so many of the Africans and other people from higher power distance cultures want us to be much more clear and authoritarian when we're preaching. They want us to tell them what the Scripture says about how they live their lives in a very clear and decisive way. And the low power distance people want us to help them explore so that they can come to their own sense of the meaning. If you all have an answer about how to do both at the same time, I'd be like to know. It's hard, but it's one of those unspoken. It's a hidden down deep in our iceberg somewhere reality that we keep running into each other on, because of just what we expect when we talk about the Word of God being the Bible being the Word of God. Finally. And there are a lot of other ones. If you go look up the Globe study online, you can read all about all of these studies. High tolerance for ambiguity versus low tolerance for ambiguity. What do you think that America is, without me defining it very much? It's low. You see this in things like legal documents, right? We're a people of contracts. We want it all spelled out. The relationship is only as broad and deep as what it's spelled out on the page. It even comes into, prenuptial agreements. In the most intimate of our relationships, we want to spell it all out. That's a sign that we have a low tolerance for ambiguity. High tolerance for yeah, go ahead.
Well, how that contrasts with the previous bullet point we were just saying that in America, when we look at preaching styles, we prefer to be led into it, provide some challenges and avenues to explore, but we don't be told. That's where I was thinking we have a high tolerance for ambiguity because we're willing to feel into those differences. We want to make those decisions ourselves. We don't want it spelled out.
Right. That's a kink in the argument, and I think there's an answer to it, but I can't remember what it is.
If you're talking, then the first one's going to be more about maybe preaching style or even scriptural texts or how we take them would be the power distance. What is the arena then for this ambiguity?
It's in common life. It is in things in. You think about your own parish or your own, if you were working in a field ed site and you're getting ready to do an event and you needed some supplies, what would happen? How would the supplies get procured? What would you be expected to do? How would that all get resolved? Right, so you need $100 worth of supplies, and you're a poor seminarian, so you don't have $100. So what's going to happen? You're going to request some money, cash or credit card, right?
I would assume that there's procedures that are in place that you find out, you go to the person that knows what they are, they tell you what to do, and you follow them, and it happens.
Right, and the procedures are things like you have to bring a receipt. You only pay for what is on the list. You have to account for, if you get cash, you got to bring back the exact change, right? These are not ambiguous kinds of things. If you were in another culture where ambiguity is more tolerated, they might say, yeah, just ask people for some money and gather up some money and go get what you need. And you say, do you need a receipt? And they say, no, I trust you. Right? I mean, there's just a totally different kind of, and these are not, again, this is without value. These are different ways of functioning. The tolerance for ambiguity comes out also in things like how we approach time. Okay? James Pluteman talks about people being monochronic or polychronic. Okay, monochronic is American, right? You do one thing at a time. It's not always American, but Western European, right? We have hours, we go to work, we get off from work, and then we do our leisure stuff, right? You don't do personal calls at the office, whatever, all those things. Monochronic. At the church, right, you have worship at this time, and if people were having, if somebody wanted a pastoral appointment, you wouldn't schedule it during worship, right? Because that's worship time. But in a polychronic culture, time and space can function in multiple ways at the same time. Many things can go on similarly. I mean, honestly, our Dinka congregation worships at noon. They worship for a long time. People come and they go. They sometimes have meetings while the service is going on, and then those people go back in. And I mean, it's crazy making for me, but it's natural for them. They can't understand. If I say, look, call me before 5 because then I'm going to go home and be with my family, they're like, aren't you a priest? And there's some validity to that if it were an emergency, but that's not how they function, right? Their time is a lot more malleable, ambiguous. So the ambiguity meant here is more in terms of sort of rules and procedures and how much stuff gets written down, when things happen, where things happen, as opposed to the high power distance, low power distance approach in terms of authority. Okay? Any comments or questions on those cultural differences? These are really important when you start thinking about functioning in a multicultural community. And that could be true whether you're talking about in a parish community or whether you're going to be on a mission team with people from other cultures, right? Because things like, what's going to make you crazy? Well, if the event is supposed to start at noon and you show up at 11:30, right, to be ready for the kickoff time, and nobody shows up until 4, right? You're going to want to know so that you're not looking for whose head to cut off. You're going to want to know that you should expect this before, when you're going in. You're going to need to communicate differently with people. If you are a collaborative person from a low power distance culture, and you go in and you want to consult with everybody about whether we're going to have 2 speakers or 4 speakers tomorrow, and everybody else is from a high power distance culture that really wants you to make a decision so they can get on with their work, right? These cause conflict. So whether it's in a parish or other places, you want to be aware of these differences. When we're not aware of these global kinds of differences between cultures, we get so caught up in trying to figure out the particulars of the particular groups with whom we're working that we well, it's like sort of digging through an iceberg for a particular rock, and hard to figure out what the implication is. Okay? Okay, so culture's like an iceberg, but I want to propose something that I have discovered at Ascension. And I apologize, I should have made the print bigger on this. It's possible, though, that culture, it's not so much that it's more like a clock, but that it's also like a clock. And if this doesn't work, I'll take full credit. Don't blame any of those authors I've mentioned, because it just came to me one day. Okay, you can look at this clock. It's beautiful, isn't it? I think this only works if it's an old-fashioned clock. Okay, you can enjoy it, you can use it, you can read the time. You might not wonder what's inside of it, right? But when the clock is working well, it's because the hidden inner parts are working together. That is, that it's the cogs and the wheels, right? They come up against each other. The teeth have to fit and not be broken. The levers have to be connected to the right pieces. And you can't just take pieces out and replace them with other pieces and expect it to still function. Now, the reason I bring this up is because when you're working with cross-culturally and you're trying to make a parish work, the things that come up are the same things that come up in every parish. Who gets to use which room when? Is it okay for the children to run through the parish hall with cups of red Kool-Aid over the white carpet that somebody thought would be beautiful? Or, who should be invited to come to this meeting, and what is the scope of their authority? As a leader, because I'm always operating out of my own culture and have often not been aware of the depth and the connections within other cultures, I tend to think that other cultures can fix something to make our life work together better. Things like how they supervise their children, right? Everybody knows that there is only one appropriate way to supervise children in the church, right? Story about the Dinka, okay? The Dinka in southern Sudan, the way that they have their households is that they have, each family has a collection of individual huts that are about, they're low enough that I probably couldn't walk through they're high inside, but low doorways. And they're about as big from here to, big enough that somebody tall could sleep in them, but not huge. They're one room. Each hut is one room. And there's a circle of them. And mom has her hut, and dad has his hut, and the children have huts, like together, like all the girl children and all the boy children, and the kids supervise themselves in a much different way, and the parents parent in a much different way than what we expect in sort of an insular family way that we do things in America. Okay, so imagine you come out of a refugee camp and you come and land yourself in Dallas, Texas, of all places, right? And you're used to the community, the compound being a safe place for children to do whatever children do. Except that here we have gas stoves and drawers full of really sharp knives that the caterer uses, and cars driving through the parking lot between the playground and the church. Okay, so changing the way you supervise children seems like a really important thing, but you can't just expect that to be changed and not to change other things, right? So what do we say? We've got some adults have got to be supervising the children at all times. Okay, but then when the women are meeting, then somebody's left out. Right? They're not. And so then the authority structures there and the collaborative decision making that's part of the Dinka culture doesn't happen. And so the point about the clock is that when you go into a cross-cultural setting and you identify certain things that need to be fixed, you got to ask questions like, so you have a multicultural potluck, okay? Everybody brings their favorite food. Ask the question, who prepared the food? How did the materials get purchased? Who paid for them? Where were the children? Where were the men? Where were the women? And you start realizing that even the most mundane thing actually has implications, threads, webs throughout the functioning of that culture. And so sensitive and patient, where change needs to make change, right? Because children can't run in parking lots where there are cars and be in kitchens where there are big knives, right? But where changes need to be made, helping figure out and listen how the change can happen in a way that doesn't damage the culture, right? The problem with the iceberg analysis is that it just everything's lumped in together. Those things actually work together. We mentioned language before, right? Language has words spoken outside. It also has ways that you use your body. It also has tonalities and all that stuff, right? You can't just tell somebody to speak up, right, and be assertive. It can change the whole meaning of what they're saying. So, any comments or questions about that? Does that make sense to you? A little bit. So, in a church, do we have to build one clock? Do we have to figure out a way to take, apart from this and apart from that to make one parish culture? That's a question. I don't think so. But let's think about, yeah.
Well, because I wanted to ask, is
Yeah.
it a question?
It's a question. No, and I think it's always a question. It goes back to that question about what style of multicultural congregation are you going to have, right? What is the missional goal of pursuing multiculturalism? Why should we do it?
Because it makes the community more reflective of the community, the divine community.
Okay, good answer. Is that Revelation? All the nations gathered around the throne of God? We hope for that, right? I'd like to be ready. Okay, good answer. Why else?
Through other cultures, we learn of God in new ways, and we get to know new faces and understandings of God.
Absolutely. Right. RO, whatever understanding any one of us has of God or any one culture has of God, it's by nature limited. And we get more of those pieces, we get a better picture, right? It's like looking through one piece of glass or looking at a stained glass window, right? Any other reasons? What about the non-spiritual reasons? Yeah.
I think whenever we are with other cultures, we actually get a firmer grasp on our own.
Exactly. Okay. Firmer grasp, both maybe for good sometimes and for ill, right? Or not for ill, but both the strengths and the problems with our own culture.
Non-spiritually, I mean, this culture of ours, or the society of ours, is getting more and more diverse. So we want to remain relevant, and relevant's not a good word, but you know what I mean by that. We're going to have to learn how to be a diverse.
Right. Right. I mean, in the Episcopal Church, the number of people that we have that we can reach out to that are, Anglo with a liberal arts education and like to hold a bunch of books and sing complicated hymns and sit in committee meetings and use Robert's Rules of Orders and I'm a cradle Episcopalian. I love the Episcopal Church, but our harvest field is shrinking if that's what we're looking for, right? Okay, so in practical terms, we want to survive. We got to find somebody else to speak to.
Well, it sounds like the Ascension, part of this is about loving your neighbor. This is who you really are, and
Good. Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about that. Yeah, does loving your neighbor involve, worshiping together? I mean, is that inherently?
I think that's a good question. We're gonna push on this in a minute. Okay, but that's a good question, right? That like those other things about what style of multicultural congregation you talked about, some of the assumptions we make are not necessarily the only faithful response. So the assumption that loving your neighbor means worshiping together may not actually be the only answer. But are there any other reasons? What's our world like today in terms of how people who are different are getting along? I mean, the world, the globe, all over. What's the news like out there? What's happening in Nigeria? Anybody know? Oh, my friends. Conflicts. I mean, people are getting killed. Maybe in the name of religion, but certainly maybe in the name of politics, right? There's people getting blown up, churches getting burned on Christmas Day. What's happening in Sudan these days? Anybody know?
The North and South are still in conflict, and they still have the warlords that are fighting over everything. It sounds like, and there is a lot is going on trying to secure the natural resources.
Okay. And perhaps even more disturbing, within the South, within the new country of South Sudan, there are tribes attacking other tribes, stealing their cattle and killing off their people. Okay? So is there any practical, perhaps not, actually it is the most profoundly spiritual reason. Why does it matter if we know how to get along with each other across cultures? What's the prayer book tell us is the ministry of the church? Reconciliation, right? To bring people to reconciliation with God and with each other. So if we can't in the church somehow figure out how to give understanding people across cultures, we may not be surprised at how hard it is for us to help people in the world get along. But so anyway, so let's think about this. So we're getting ready this weekend for a strategic planning event, and as part of that, we met in groups and surveyed people, distinctive from in cultural groups, to ask them what they gain from being part of a multicultural congregation, what they feel like they give up. Okay, so some of the losses: they lose the easy confidence that they are understanding other people and that they are being understood. What do you think? Is this a highly important issue as part of a worshiping community, or low? It is incredibly tiring for every contact to be ambiguous that way, not knowing whether you're understood or understanding. Okay? The spiritual fulfillment that comes from worshiping in our ethnic style. This is more often said by the Africans and the African Americans, some by the Hispanic than by the Anglos, but it's said by everybody. They feel the loss of clarity and control. And again, this is across different cultures say the same thing. Our music, right? Whatever our music is, everybody feels like they lose it if they're. And then preaching in the style we recognize as biblical. Again, okay. So these are significant. There are other things people say they lose. I found less significant. These seemed significant. These are things people are giving up and feeling the loss of. So what do they gain? Some of the things you said. They gain experience of the heavenly vision from Revelation. They gain the appreciation and understanding of their own spiritual paths. And they gain opportunities for mission, both locally and globally, that are unavailable without the gifts of these brothers and sisters. That is, if you think about having an entry into an ethnic community as a parish, you're greatly helped if you have somebody from that community. Okay? But also gifts like prayer, Gifts like interpreting the Bible in other ways than our familiar, hearing new meanings from old stories. We get those gifts. So I think that goes to it goes to the question here that he asks: is it necessarily worshiping together? Okay, so is this kind of multicultural work worth the cost? Okay, so we have both theological and missional reasons for working cross-culturally and having multicultural congregations. We certainly feel like we have good missional reasons at Ascension for continuing this work. The story of Babel talks about people being divided, right? They can't understand each other. Pentecost talks about people understanding about the mighty deeds of God in their own tongue. It's great to feel like you're in that moment of Pentecost where the Spirit is making it possible to understand God's deeds of power from people you don't expect to understand. That's a real gift. And as I already said, we can't effectively reach the diverse populations around us in Dallas and in any of the cities and places from which you all come, without the spiritual gifts of the baptized from those cultures. Okay, so those are on the plus side. However, here's the downside. The complexity of multicultural community demands high emotional and spiritual investment. By whom? Everybody. It demands patience. It demands not getting your feelings hurt easily. It demands repeating yourself. It demands trying to understand something that is really contrary to the way you understand God, all kinds of stuff. Another downside is that we can keep minority bodies in a powerless place when we insist that they be a full part of our congregations. And this is what I mean, especially if you're not from the Episcopal Church. For instance, our Dinka congregation, which had an average Sunday attendance of 85 last year, they have their own worship service. We don't speak Dinka, and they do. And so they worship in a separate service most of the time, shared services on feast days and special occasions. But they had an average Sunday attendance of 85. That's bigger than a huge portion of the Episcopal Church. They would be, if they could financially support themselves, they'd be a parish with their own representation. They'd have multiple representation at a diocesan convention. They'd have their own seat at the table. But because they're part of the Ascension congregation, they have to, their people run for office against other people from other cultures. They have to figure out how to function in a vestry that operates like a Western European business model kind of business meeting. There are significant barriers to their full participation in the circles of power. And so when we do multicultural congregation in this way, we have to acknowledge the fact that we may actually be doing them a disservice when it comes to having their say in diocesan circles or in the larger church. It can reduce rather than enhance the community's ability to reach any one culture very effectively for Christ. Why is that? Okay? What happens when we try and worship together? What do they lose? What do we lose? Some of the spiritual fulfillment of worshiping in the style that's easy for us. Okay, so if you may come to Ascension one Sunday or for African night or for some other special service and say, wow, that was so fun. But are you ready to do it every week? And if your language is Igbo and your style of preaching is a kind of African evangelical style of preaching, are you going to put up with Kay Ryan every week and feel like you can bring your friends there and they're really going to get what they need to live their lives and gain strength? Right? It actually can hurt our ability to gather people in when we insist on doing one on group. So it's a little bit like always just learning to waltz. Okay, this is not a very good cross-cultural example. But did any of you ever do cotillion or learn to dance? Okay, when you're learning to dance, like, I don't just mean like, casual dancing, but like a ballroom dance, right? You have a partner, and your partner has feet. And there are certain directions you're supposed to go, and when you go the wrong direction, your partner goes the other way, you pull on each other. You sometimes run into other people on the dance floor, right? But over the course of time, the idea is that you learn to waltz, and it's fun. That's the idea, at least. But sometimes when you're in a multicultural setting or doing cross-cultural work, every encounter is like the first dance. Always, you have to be willing to always have your feet stepped on. You have to be always willing to say you're sorry because you're stepping on your partner. And couples are always bumping into each other, right? Even the ones who figure out how to dance are then being run into by the people who can't figure it out. So it's a little bit like that, chaos. So that's the downside. I still think it's worthwhile. Why? This isn't the best picture, especially up there. It's better on my computer because you can't see the people around there. I'll get to at the end, I'll show you the All Saints baptism. Why? Because it still does give you that sense of all the baptized being one in Christ, serving together. Okay, so it is worth it. So before I finish this formal part, I want to talk a little bit about what the leadership needs are. Right? You get these cute groups of kids who actually have friends who have totally different backgrounds. People who have survived, their parents have survived wars, they've immigrated, they have different rules about dating, and they all talk to each other, and it's and learn and grow and get a sense also of what God is like. So, okay, so it's true that we may have goodwill, but we're not as competent as we'd like to think. So how do we go about this? I just want to stop there for a second. And the reason I say that, we may have goodwill, but we may not be as competent as we thought, is that I grew up in cross-cultural relationship work, doing that all the time, and in a multicultural setting. I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. My dad is a newspaper reporter and then an editor. My mother worked for the state government. My uncles worked for the Indian reservation. My grandfather worked for Bureau of Indian Affairs. And we had parties with people from Native Americans and African Americans and Hispanics. And I thought I really had this. I think I mostly enjoyed the food and the dancing. But I thought I had it. But it is a different thing to function and try and achieve common goals. Okay? So what do we say about leadership? The normative leadership style in the Episcopal Church in the United States is Western European. And often it's from business or commerce. What are the books that people tell you to read? Go read Good to Great. And go read Good to Great. It's a great book. But it's culturally biased, right? Who's the normative leader in America? What gender?
Male.
What race?
White.
What kind of education? MBA, law, some kind of graduate school probably, right? Economic background? At least upper middle class, and with our current political system, sorry, I'm not supposed to cause trouble here. Right, so in the room here, you've got a few people. What age? Between 40 and 55, usually is cream, maybe 60 if you're lucky. Right, but a lot of us standing in this room are not leadership material according to the norm. You all are all leadership material. But, and then when we go function, we expect everybody else to behave like that norm, even if they're not. Right? So you can be a woman, but you still have to wear a business suit. Right? I got mine on for you today, even pants. I don't mean to make fun like there's nothing good from that model, but it is only one model. It is competitive, it's hierarchical, it's, in a sense, a winner-take-all approach to leadership. So it's not everything. Okay, so we need to learn and recognize contributions and styles of other cultures. There's a great book called Salsa, Soul, and Spirit. I didn't bring it in here, I don't think. No, I didn't bring it in. But I'll send you all the name. But it takes leadership models from the African American community, from the Native American community, from the Hispanic community in the United States, with examples of people and the styles of leadership and what they add to the leadership mix. And I recommend it because in order to lead cross-culturally, we're going to have to add to our toolbox of leadership habits. Even so-called biblical models of leadership are expressed in culturally bound styles, right? So there's good leadership stuff in the Bible, but it's not like there's some sanitized, universal biblical model of leadership. What does it mean to be a servant leader like Jesus?
Well, you clearly never offend anybody.
Never offend anyone, right? That's okay. I mean, that's one way you can read it, right? It's being sarcastic, I know, but it's not without, like, people believe that, right?
What are you talking about? Picking up a metaphor.
I mean, my point is that if you take Moses, or if you take Ruth, if you take Tabitha in Acts of the Apostles, whatever, it's not like there's one leadership style, but we act as if, well, I won't go there again, the sort of white man. So what do we need? So to lead cross-culturally, parishes need learning leaders from each cultural community. Real leaders, not just subservient people. I'm the rector, and I find it very hard to let go of power, control, authority, and wanting to say what goes everywhere. But I really don't know how to make the Dinka congregation work, because I don't know what's inside the clock. And my attempts to make them function like the parish leadership structure I learned in seminary and in the Episcopal Church doesn't work. I mean, I've tried it, and you know the definition of insanity, right? It's trying the same thing over and over, expecting other results. I can't do it. Same thing in the Igbo culture. I know that home visits are a huge thing in pastoral relationships in the Igbo community, but my home visits don't achieve what Father Daniel's home visits do, because he understands what to say and what questions to ask and what things are taboo. You got to have learning leaders from each cultural community. And the reason I say learning leaders is because, frankly, my Dinka leaders and Igbo leaders are just as culturally biased as I am. And they, in their attempts to lead across cultural boundaries, they can cause as much trouble as I do. So they have to be willing to learn and not just make assumptions about the dominant culture or about the other African cultures. They've got to be learning leaders. Whether they're lay or ordained isn't important, but they've got to be people who will learn and work together. The parish itself needs education about cultural differences. And again, this is not just the Anglos who need this. It's everybody. There's a lot of studies done on why the initial diversity training stuff in business didn't work. Places like IBM and other places that would have these models of trying to bring minorities into leadership positions. And they first tried to recruit promising minorities and teach them how to be leaders in the Western European style. And that didn't work because it totally was dismissive of the person and their culture. So then they tried to do sensitivity training to the people at the top so they'd be ready to receive people, right? And so all the responsibility was on the people already in the top circle. And then they got mad because the minorities coming up didn't stick around. It was too hard. It didn't work. Right? The responsibility has to be on everybody. If we want to be together, everybody has to do their work. So the parish itself, all the cultural groups need education about cultural differences. And perhaps most important, they need formation on the theological reasons for pursuing and nurturing multicultural community and mission. I mean, it's not enough for it to just be politically correct. It's not enough for us to be horrified every time we hear that statistic about 11 o'clock Sunday morning being the most segregated hour in American culture. That's not enough. We have to actually believe that what we're doing has something to do with Christ's call to us to be one body and our ability to go out to all the nations. If it's not about that, then in the end, frankly, it is far too much work and it's far too damaging to the spiritual, or potentially damaging the spiritual lives of our people. So what does the leader need? Self-knowledge, especially honest assessment of cultural biases. How many people knew that your insistence that people arrive on time is a cultural bias? It's not some objectively right thing. It's a cultural bias. It may be the way we need to function. Nonetheless, it's a cultural bias. So those biases go beyond the externals. It's not just that we don't like the way people dress, or that we don't particularly care for their music, or that we think they shouldn't speak so sternly to their children, or that their women should have more freedom. It's not, those are externals. Right? Our biases go to deep stuff about values and worldview, and being ready to allow other people to see the world in a different way. Leaders need time. My congregation has about just under 600 members. That is not a huge congregation. But multicultural work is really complicated and complex. And it takes time. And sometimes vestries don't understand how much more relational time it takes to work with 600 people who are of 5 different cultures than 600 people who are mostly all coming out of the same background. Designing what kind of formation work works, figuring out the questions of what will worship look like, and whether it's okay to have multiple services in different languages and different musical styles. Those things take time and prayer. So you need to know the complexity of this endeavor. You'll find yourself much more peaceful and successful if you go into it knowing that. I did not. I wouldn't turn back. I mean, I would not trade it, but I wish I had known a little better. And you got to practice accommodating to styles while living with yourself. So I'm going to finish this part and go on break just with a story. When I came to Ascension, within the first month, there was a wedding of an African couple. And the altar guild got me aside and warned me that African weddings never start on time. And they were clearly distressed about it. And they wanted to know how we could make sure it started on time. And I was 35 years old. Felt very young. I was very new. Felt like I had jumped in way over my head, even not knowing what I had jumped into. And so they were some of the powerful people in the congregation, so I responded and started trying to figure out how to make sure the wedding started on time. And so I went and had the conversation with the couple. And I figured that what the problem was that it wasn't clear enough, right? Because I'm from a low ambiguity culture, so I figured I would line it all out on paper, and we would, of course, start on time. And everybody agreed, right? Everybody said, yes, we will be there on time to get started. And so the Saturday came along, and then I went up there excessively early, being a young rector and all this. And so I, probably was there an hour and a half before the wedding. But of course, the bride was supposed to get dressed there, and she was supposed to be there earlier than that. They were going to let her in. Well, I get there, and there's the altar guild, wedding guild standing at the door like this. There are no cars in the parking lot except for mine and the wedding guild. There's nobody there. And the hour goes, hour and a half goes, time for the wedding comes, and there's like 3 American friends of the couple wondering where everyone is. There's still not one member of the wedding party has arrived at the church. And at about an hour and a half after the wedding was supposed to start, finally there were enough people that we could make them start. But I did not give up. We had more African weddings. In fact, over the next 10 years, I tried charging people a late fee. I tried threatening not to do the service at all. I tried planning to send home my staff. I tried, multiple meetings with the couple and the grooms. I tried telling them to tell their guests, put whatever time they wanted on their invitation, but to tell me the time at which they were going to start. And I'm telling you, none of it worked. They would apologize. They would write me the check for the late fee. They would beg me to do their wedding, even though I was seething, which is not spiritually good, but none of it worked. And the reason it didn't work was because I was insisting on trying to force them into my culture. I have finally found something that works. You want to know the secret? The secret is that I make that day a work day. And I go to the church. And my choir master makes it a work day. And we have plans to meet with each other and plan liturgy and do all kinds of things.
And you say, call me when you're ready.
And I am ready, and when they get there and they're ready, we do the service. It isn't really rocket science. And it may seem like just giving in, but I think what it does is actually honor the fact that it's not about being late. This is not a tardiness issue. This is about the rituals they have on the day of their wedding and preparing for that. The rituals they have with their children and with the other members of the family and the visiting of the families who have agreed that these 2 people will be married. I don't pretend to get all of that, but I have figured out that for me to insist on them doing it my way is to break things that are far deeper than a habit of not following American time standards. So that's what leaders need, is to practice accommodating self. So I don't think we need to go through all this, but there's some ideas about building successful teams. And here's All Saints, 2010. And again, not the greatest picture, but here's an adult baptism of a woman born in Mumbai and her son here. This is her husband. Twin Nigerian boys. You know, twins in Nigeria used to be executed. Not executed, but given up for death. It's a taboo. An American. That's a Sudanese family there. And another Sudanese baby over here. So that was our wonderful multicultural, and I think actually her family is Hindu. Yes, a convert from Hinduism. So it's fun, and it's I wouldn't trade it, but prepare yourselves. Thanks.